England faces its darkest hour today as its forces confront invaders from both north and south who claim the English throne.
The claim to the throne is as strong as the army you can muster.
Wars are not won by numbers, they are won by courage.
I'm King of England, legally chosen by the Witan and anointed of God.
Just hours ago, England's King Harald and his forces turned back one of these invaders, smashing the Viking landing force in a bloody battle that's left thousands dead. The other threat from Duke William of Normandy, poised at this hour to launch his own invasion from France. It's September 25th, 1066, and this is Timeline. I'm Stephen Bell for Timeline. At the beginning of this day, 3 kings claimed the English crown, but now only chaos and confusion reign. The trouble in England began 8 months ago when the previous king died without an heir. England's ruling council elected Harald Godwinson king in an attempt to prevent strangers from taking control. But it didn't work. In France, Duke William of Normandy immediately claimed the throne, while in Norway, King Harald Hardradi moved quickly to re-establish an old Viking claim. In Normandy, Duke William continues to claim that he was the old king's chosen successor. At this hour, his invasion force is preparing to cross the English Channel to enforce the claim. Viking King Hardradi's claim rests on shakier ground. A generation ago, England was part of a Viking empire that included Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. With a power vacuum in England, Hardradi hoped to re-establish this empire, hopes that were crushed today by Godwinson's English forces. Thousands of Viking warriors now lie dead, including their king, Harald Hardradi.
Now, he lies low here. Where again? See his like.
While England's future remains in doubt, today's battle does deal a death blow to Viking domination in Northern Europe. For centuries, Viking raiders and their longships were a feared sight throughout Europe, first raiding the coasts of England and France, then building colonies and eventually establishing Viking rule across the region. There now seems little chance of this rule being restored. How did the Vikings come to this crossroad? We begin with their invasion of England. Owen of Canarfon reports.
In a well-planned operation, Hardradi put together the greatest invasion force ever seen. From Norway, Ireland, Iceland, and Scotland, he brought together 300 ships, with 9,000 of the fiercest fighting men in the world.
No matter what any man may say, England belongs to the Viking world. What language do you hear around you in the Danelaw? Yes, it's Norse. It's not the English of the Saxons. People here are our people, and by God, they should be ruled by a good Viking king, not by a Saxon usurper like Harald Godwinson, or even worse, by William, the bastard son of a Norman duke.
The Viking landing took place on the coast just a few miles away from where we are here in York. Meanwhile, Harald Godwinson of England was 200 miles away to the south. It seemed impossible he'd be able to raise an army and reach York in time to quash the Viking invasion. And yet he did it. Leading his Saxon army northwards, he made a grueling forced march and caught up with the Vikings just a few hours ago at Stamford Bridge. It was the Vikings' turn to be surprised.
We were caught like chickens, pecking at their feed. I mean, some of us were not even armed. We'd left all the heavier stuff in our ships. Suddenly, there's a cloud of dust, a Saxon army where no army should have been.
Casualties are still being counted, but it's known that at least half the Viking invasion force, almost 5,000 men, are dead, including, of course, their leader, Harald Hardradi.
Oh, and I understand there were people in York who actually supported the Viking invasion.
Yes, most of them are descended from the Vikings. They speak Norse. And in fact, this area of England is called Danelaw because it's been settled by the Vikings for over 200 years. So it's hardly surprising that when backing one side or the other, many chose the Vikings.
But will the English punish them for supporting the Vikings?
No, I'd say quite the opposite. In fact, King Harald Godwinson of England will be concentrating on winning back their support. He urgently needs to unite his country against other potential invaders. He really cannot afford to antagonize them. The king is now coming out. My lord, how safe is England now the Vikings have been defeated?
The dogs that want to devour England still yap from across the sea. Now there's one less of them. I'm King of England, legally chosen by the Witan and anointed of God. Anyone who tries to steal England's royal crown will get the same hearty Saxon welcome Norway got today.
The Saxon King of England, Harald Godwinson, who only came to the throne 9 months ago when the previous king died without an heir. He was elected by England's ruling council in a vote which caused serious political problems. It wasn't only Harald Hardradi, the Viking leader defeated today, who objected. The Duke of Normandy also claimed prior right to the English throne.
So why was Harald Godwinson selected?
Because he's the most powerful earl and a Saxon. The council desperately wanted a Saxon king for a Saxon England. And no sooner was he elected than he had to prepare for the invasion he knew must come.
Oh, and this obviously has put the King of England in a bind. He had no choice but to march his troops to the north to fight the Vikings. But doesn't this leave him open to an invasion in the south by William of Normandy?
Well, it's unprecedented that fighting should continue so late in the season, but Godwinson himself believes he's safe from further invasion until after the spring planting next year.
In France, however, William of Normandy has assembled a large invasion force, and it doesn't look like those troops are going to be going home for the winter. In fact, our sources tell us they're just waiting for the weather to change before they launch their own attack on England. Owen, are we seeing a new pattern of fighting emerging now?
Well, with two such massive campaigns so late in the season, it certainly seems so. But the Vikings and the Normans, they're mercenary soldiers. They make their living from war. They're able to fight for 12 months in the year. Whereas Godwinson, well, he still relies on peasants to make up the bulk of his force. And with lands to tend and crops to raise, his troops cannot be anything other than part-time soldiers.
Thank you, Owen. In fact, the same winds that made it so easy for the Viking invaders to sail to England are keeping William of Normandy's ships bottled up across the English Channel in France. Louis de Jaen is in Duke William's camp at St. Valery with this report.
In the months the army has been waiting, nothing has been watched more anxiously than this weather vane. William's invasion force needs a wind from the south to blow his ships 60 miles across the Channel to England. Although the Pope has blessed William's enterprise, the weather's been against him with a steady west wind.
Priests have been so busy praying you'd think they'd huff and puff us to England all by themselves. Perhaps God doesn't intend the Duke to succeed.
These Normans or Norsemen are Vikings too. They settled here over the past 150 years in lands given by or taken from the French king. William claims England's last king, Edward the Confessor, made him his heir. And so, as soon as Edward's death was announced, he began planning his invasion.
It's all new to me, this. Horses on a boat. It's all very well in theory. Not so easy in practice. Mind you, you've got to hand it to William for having a go. Still, 3,000 horses on boats.
It can make the difference between victory and defeat. The knights coming off their boats with their horses and straight into battle. We did it once before, in Sicily, and it worked then.
William himself is directly descended from Rollo the Viking, who pillaged as far as Paris before being bought off with Normandy. My lord, there is talk in the camp that even if you succeed in crossing, you will be greatly outnumbered.
Wars are not won by numbers, they are won by courage. Harald Godwinson fights to keep a stolen crown, a breaker of oaths who once swore to support my claim. I fight to gain what's mine by right, and God will grant me victory.
In recent years, the Normans have abandoned most of their Viking ways. Indeed, they have been accused of becoming more French than the French. But the landless knights who've gathered around Duke William are here for the usual Viking reasons, the chance of plunder and the joy of war.
So what is morale like?
Not too bad, considering. William has exerted rigid control over his troops, but the one thing he can't control is the wind. You must remember these men are superstitious, only too ready to believe in omens and portents, like bad weather. He may not show it, but we are looking at a very worried man this evening. If the weather doesn't change soon, he could lose his chance to conquer England.
Thank you, Louis. And we'll be coming back to Louis in just a little bit. It's perhaps ironic that the spotlight has shifted to Normandy now and its ruler, Duke William. Though Normandy started as a Viking colony, It's now playing an increasingly important role in European politics, while today's defeat in England just underscores the decline of the original Viking homelands. What is the state of the Viking world today? And what's the future likely to bring? We'll try to answer those questions when we come back.
Rough, harsh, even hairy. That old cowhide parchment, all right for everyday copying, but for those special times, isn't quality what matters? When only the softest and youngest lambskins are good enough. Vellum, polished and bleached to a creamy whiteness that will never yellow and never crack. When you care enough to give the very best, vellum, naturally.
Frankly, today's defeat in England does nothing to dispel the Viking legend, a legend of a race of fierce warriors. But they're just as well known as intrepid explorers and as colonizers not afraid to travel anywhere. The Viking influence has spread southeast through Russia to the Black Sea and Byzantium, southwest through England, Ireland, France, and down to the Mediterranean, and northwest to uncharted lands beyond the Western Ocean. Descendants of Vikings still live as they have for hundreds of years now. Siboletto of Zimbabwe traveled to Iceland to get the story.
Going a Viking, setting sail in long ships to plunder, trade, or just to see what's at the other end of an ocean has been second nature to Vikings of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark for hundreds of years. Nowhere in Europe are there faster ships or more skilled sailors. Though these Viking long ships are ocean-going, they still draw so little water they can land warriors on just about any beach or sail up any river. King Harald himself bought Norway's crown with wealth he raised going a Viking. It may be Viking raiders that first establish themselves on new territory, but others will follow and gradually colonize it. Then these long ships become the settlers' transports, carrying everything needed to start a new life in a new land.
I fought with Harold in Palestine. Heroes of the Byzantine Empire, they called us. And not a Muslim could stand against us. But you get tired of fighting other people's wars. You want a land of your own. So I came back, where you can breathe the clean air. And there's no kings nor lordlings telling you how to blood your axe.
King Harold's just as bad anyway. He and them other kings don't allow raiding in waters they claim for themselves. That's why I left Norway. It's getting so a Viking couldn't make an honest living anymore. What's wrong with piracy, I'd like to know?
In recent years, there have been fewer opportunities for settlement. Europe has learned how to resist Viking attacks. It's only here in the north that Viking fleets still sail out into unknown waters. This ship has just returned from Vinland, the new country across the Western Ocean settled by Leif Erikson barely 60 years ago.
You keep on sailing west through fog so thick, the sun don't shine for days. Ice all around, grinding and squealing. Till you know, even the old gods can't sail. Then empty lands, till the sea is warm, and you smell the sweet smell of Vinland. You gotta watch the natives. Sometimes they'll come out of the woods to trade. More often they'll meet you with a shower of arrows. Skraelings, we call them. On account of their warlike screeches.
Separated from Europe by hundreds of miles of ocean, Iceland has kept traditional Viking customs that have already vanished in the homelands of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Here there are no kings, just a national assembly of free men made up of the leading chiefs and warriors of the island. And today sees the opening of the annual meeting of that assembly, the Althing. As beacons blaze around the island, the 144 members elect their new president, the lawgiver, who will serve for the next 3 years.
The lawgiver doesn't take command. He speaks the law and settles disputes. As long as the law is kept, nobody tells us what to do on our land.
I was honored. My verses praised by kings and sultans from Russia to Spain. Now I'm old, and I can only remember the old songs about the warriors waiting in Valhalla's halls for the horn to sound when they'll ride to the final battle of the gods. I hate this Christian world.
Yet Iceland accepted the new faith.
What else could we do? All Europe was Christian. We voted in assembly. A period of transition, old and new, side by side. When we took over Europe's faith, we took over Europe's ways. I'm cold.
Though the Vikings no longer rule all of Northern Europe, every land they've settled has absorbed a respect for their just laws and a liking for their ideals of freedom. This Viking island has, by its very remoteness, remained isolated from both progress and the fighting that have swept Europe. Many of the customs that survive here no longer exist in the homelands of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. So now the question is, how much longer can Iceland retain its Viking ways? This is Siboletto of Zimbabwe reporting from Reykjavik, Iceland.
The Vikings have never been known for playing it safe, and that was made clear by King Harald Hardradi's decision to invade England. It was a calculated risk that did not pay off, costing Hardradi his life and the Vikings their domination over Northern Europe. Who was this man whose every move had an impact on Europe? For an answer, we go to Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantium. That's where Harald Hardradi first achieved prominence, and Selim Karasi has our report.
Vikings, or Russians as they're known hereabouts, have been coming to the city for over 200 years. First called Byzantium, then Constantinople, New Rome. It was called just the Great City by the Vikings. It has been the capital of the Roman Empire of the East and the center of Christian civilization since it was first founded by the Emperor Constantine more than 700 years ago. At one time, Viking longships raided the empire's coastline and once mounted an open attack on the city. But for the past 150 years, there's been a commercial treaty between the Russian Vikings and Byzantium. Now they come to trade slaves and goods from all over the Viking world. In recent years, they have also come to sell their fighting skills in the service of New Rome's emperor. This is where Harald Hardradi of Norway came more than 30 years ago. He came like all Vikings for fighting and plunder, and he found both in the service of the Emperor of Constantinople.
What a fox he was. Worked his way up from simple captain to leader of the Varangian Guard. That's the Emperor's private bodyguard. Vikings, everyone.
So, Harald came here as a mercenary, like most of the Vikings you can see around me. He did better than most, though. By the time he left, he had become the most trusted commander of the empire.
What happened then will be told and retold as long as Vikings sail the seas.
What a fuss. A slap in the face for the old empress. Hardradi kidnapped her niece, you see, pretty little Maria. Not that she's so pretty nowadays, a bit long in the tooth like the rest of us. But she was quite something back then, and worth an emperor's ransom.
And that's what the empress had to pay to get her niece back safely. Hardradi stole her out of the city under the noses of the finest soldiers of Byzantium. Everyone was making bets on how far he'd get, but he made it back home. A true Viking with ransom enough to live like a king.
No puny hireling of a Greek empress is gonna stop me. Sail!
Crafty as a fox, that one was. I was happy to hear he ended up as king in one of those barbarian northern lands. Never saw him back here again, that's for sure.
Tell them about Palestine, when King Harald went to Jerusalem.
I was with him in Russia when we kicked the Poles half the way across the country.
As you see, memories of King Harald are still fresh around here. There will be many who will mourn his death. This is Selim Karasi reporting from Constantinople.
And we'll have more on the death of King Harald Hardradi and the passing of the Viking era when we come back.
From Friday's dusk to Tuesday after matins, all wars shall cease. Observe the truths of God. Do not only start these days each week on high days.
On penalty of immediate excommunication,
Warfare is hereby prohibited on high days, holy days, feast days, and such days as shall be specified in your area. This is a public service announcement from the Archdiocese of Paris.
In the north of England, church bells are tolling in mourning today for those who died in battle. Of the 300 Viking longships that landed on England's shores, only 24 escaped, while Saxon casualties were relatively light. Owen of Canarfon is in York and has this report.
The body of the Viking leader, Harald Hardradi, King of Norway, lies in state in the parish church of St. Peter and St. Paul. His son and heir, Olaf Kaya, left here a short while ago to meet the English king. And sources close to both sides say that it's likely that a peace treaty will be signed later today. Saxons and Vikings together stand guard over the body of Norway's king, a gesture of respect ordered by Harald Godwinson of England. It's the end of an era.
No mailed shirt sheltered Norway's king as he set forth in strife. Yet his battle-hardened heart never faltered nor failed, brandishing bloody sword, his foeman's bane.
Already the Viking court poets are busy composing his epitaph. These words, along with vivid verses about the most colourful moments in Hardradi's life, will soon be told and retold wherever Vikings sail.
Oh, and among the mourners, I saw one of the leading Norse poets today, Theodulf Arnarsson. Now, he's one of those poets who has praised Hardradi frequently. Is Hardradi's reputation as Europe's greatest warrior strictly based on publicity from poets?
Yes, well, certainly that's what other warriors would say, but it's true that Norway's king was a great self-promoter. He hired the best court poets from Iceland, the home of poetry, and they compared him to the great Viking heroes of the past, like Eric Bloodaxe and Harold Bluetooth. Comparisons which may or may not stand the test of time, but there is without doubt some truth in what they wrote.
Thank you, Owen. It's not just poets and warriors who are remembering Hardradi today. Our crew went out into the Danelaw in northern England and asked people their thoughts about the Viking leader.
First amongst equals. That's what a king is. Isn't that what I've always told you? Well, Harold needed reminding of it sometimes, too. Still, I'll miss him, because he was a good king and a brave warrior.
He knew the value of a silver coin, all right. You know he bought his kingship, don't you? Came back from Byzantium with boatloads of plunder. Told young King Magnus, his nephew, you share the kingdom, I share the treasure. It was an offer he could not refuse. Cunning. A true Viking.
My man fought beside him in Russia, had his arm cut off and all. He'd been no use to me ever since. The tales they tell about him are enough to keep a dozen women satisfied. And now he's gone.
But England's King Harold now has little time to celebrate his greatest military victory. He must still keep his eye on France, where the situation has changed dramatically in just the last few moments. William of Normandy is moving ahead with his plans to attack England. Louis de Haine is in St. Valery. Louis?
Duke William of Normandy has made the decision to lower the ships, even though the wind still blows as strongly from the west.
Even for Duke William, isn't this taking an incredible risk?
Apparently he doesn't think so. A few minutes ago, local fishermen were brought to his tent. They know this coast well, and convince him the weather's about to change. A special mass is also being said, but most people here place as much reliance on the forecast of simple Norman fishermen as they do on the prayers of priests.
Louis, I'm now being told that the wind in France has shifted, and that should allow William's fleet to sail across the Channel and invade England. Is there any speculation about where the Norman troops might land?
It depends on the wind. His advisors are hoping they will land in the southern marshes, where it's almost impossible for the Saxon soldiers to oppose the landing. That's the critical moment in any invasion. If William can get his knights and horses ashore and battle ready, they'll be much more difficult to dislodge.
Thank you, Louis. Of course, England's King Harold already has his hands full. He must now try to maintain order in the northern part of the country, where loyalty is divided already between Vikings and Saxons. Recapping our top story now, one invasion of England has been turned back, another is on its way. King Harold of England has turned back one threat to his crown. English troops today crushing a Viking invasion force at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Thousands of Vikings were killed, including Viking King Harald Hardradi. Now that ends Hardradi's attempts to restore the Viking Empire of Northern Europe. At the same time, Duke William of Normandy is launching his own invasion. More than just the future of England now hangs in the balance. Norman expansion continues in Sicily and southern Italy. Norman warriors already are replacing Vikings as the military elite of the Roman Empire of Byzantium. So, if England's Harald Godwinson can stop William of Normandy, then this growing Norman power may be checked. But if not, well, then nothing stands in the way of Normandy, this once Viking colony, from becoming the dominant political power of Northern Europe. For Timeline, I'm Stephen Bell.
"19 days later, William of Normandy defeated Harald Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman conquest of England changed this island nation forever. It tied England to the continent of Europe, where it would become one of the dominant powers in the world. The line of William, known to history as William the Conqueror, continues through to the present English monarch Elizabeth II. And in fact, every important monarchy in Europe can trace its roots back to the Normans. As for the Vikings, their pioneering spirit of adventure was a shot of adrenaline everywhere they went. And today, the system of representative government enjoyed by most Western nations can be traced back to the customs and traditions of the Vikings.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.